Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. President Trump calling for U.S. District Court Judge James Boasberg to be impeached. And Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts responding to that. Not on point, but sort of on principle. Just a little bit about Boasberg. I mean, this is in relation to trying to turn around those deportation flights.
Right.
And Trump attorneys have also filed a motion to force Boasberg to recuse himself from the case, to be removed from the case. But before we get into that, and before we get into what everybody in sort of conservative media is talking about Boasberg's potential conflicts of interest because his wife's a big Dem donor and his daughter works for some NGO that is right now trying to prevent the deportations of Tren de Aragua members and other people in this country legally. Before we even get into that,
family.
Before we get to that, another case in which Boasberg presided was with respect to the sentencing of Kevin Kleinsmith, the FBI staffer who doctored an email as part of the Russian collusion witch hunt that the federal government went on. And when it was time to sentence Kleinsmith for his criminal acts, Boasberg, presiding judge, said that Kleinsmith had suffered by losing his job and his standing in the eye of a media hurricane. And so Kleinsmith essentially got a slap on the wrist, you'll recall. Mr. Kleinsmith has lost his job in government service, what has given his life much of its meaning. Yeah, it's a sad story that is completely at the hands of Mr. Kleinsmith and perhaps whoever else suggested he commit the illegal acts he committed. The judge was written by James Freeman in the Wall Street Journal at the time of the sentencing. The judge responsible for punishing an attorney who helped the FBI abuse its powers to target a political campaign and then a presidency with a collusion hoax that poisoned our politics for years is concerned about the criminal's personal search for meaning. Instead of community service, perhaps Judge Boasberg should have just ordered Kleinsmith to live, laugh, and love.
Oh, my God.
What a wonderful rhetorical flourish from James Freeman. But that's who we're talking about. So just make no mistake that there is no love loss for Boasberg from James Freeman, because now I want to update Freeman's view on this matter of impeachment. Justice Roberts said, as you heard at the news in the top of the hour, in response to the judge, like many crooked judges, I'm forced to appear before should be impeached. That's what Trump's post was. And Roberts saying that for more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. James Freeman writing on this back and forth. For reasons that have nothing to do with the particulars of this case or immigration policy, Mr. Boasberg just so happens to be a disgrace to the federal judiciary. But this column is aware of no evidence that he's committed any crimes. Impeachment is not the answer. The law for abuses against Donald Trump may tempt him to give partisan adversaries a taste of their own medicine, but his duty is to our country. In this case, Chief Justice John Roberts is correct. But he does go on to add, it would be nice if Roberts could be relied on to admonish overreaching politicians on both sides of the political aisle, like last year when AOC and others so situated introduced articles of impeachment against Justices Thomas and Alito, and Roberts was nowhere to be heard. So Boasberg is not a good guy.
No.
Or not a good judge. There are these, potential areas of conflict, but I mean, you can't just conflict a judge out of a case because his wife or his daughter are in politically related fields or make donations and so on and so forth. There has to be a nexus in addition to impeachment, talking about a nexus to actual crimes or at least violations of the bar of the canons. And Roberts, just because he's a hypocrite on the issue, doesn't mean that he's not right, even though he's not weighing in evenly. It's complicated.
And don't forget this Judge Boasberg. He sentenced a 61-year-old woman to 14 months in prison. And she was at January 6th. She was inside the Capitol. He sentenced a lot of the J6ers.
Well, D.C. Circuit Court judge, right. Yeah. For more on this, Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago, joins us. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us, as always. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm basically putting myself on the line. These are very complicated issues.
Yes. So what do you think of this sort of the passing? I was not a direct back and forth, but effectively a back and forth between the president and the Chief Justice.
Well, I mean, the Chief Justice is technically right on the question of how it is that you deal with an adverse ruling. There is no precedent whatsoever for using impeachment. And as you mentioned, if you could do it in this case, by the time you get done with all the adverse rulings by all the disappointed presidents, impeachment could be an ordinary part of American politics, and the system would come to its end. But that's not the entire story. The other thing that you actually mentioned is a little bit more disturbing. You said there is no ethical obligation to recuse yourself in a case when it turns out that your family members are actively pursuing one side of this debate, trying to make sure that immigration does not lead to massive deportations. I have the following view on that. I'm very, very worried about those kinds of relationships. Mm-hmm. They're going to clearly influence your judgment. And this is the way in which you have to think about it. If Joesburg decides, I can't handle this case because my family is too heavily involved, it's not as though the case is going to just disappear. There are many other judges in the District of Columbia that do not have that kind of conflict. And if they don't have that kind of conflict, they're much more credible to the public as large. So my view is, given the fact that there's an abundance of other people that take the case, whenever there's the slightest doubt, you should just recuse yourself even before being asked to recuse yourself by a judge, and he did not do that. And you then mentioned some of these other cases in which there were slaps on the wrist. There's also other serious allegations that he did not move fast enough when dealing with the various warrant requests when he was the head of the FISA court, which were based on the fraudulent information that you did. Submits papers that are fraudulent in order to continue an investigation for which there is no basis. This is as bad as it could get. And this has been done several times with respect to that. And a heavier sentence is surely warranted. So if you've got that kind of a track record, and if it turns out that you are, a pretty clearly, strongly Democratic Party, prudence says you should get out of the way and not let that happen. Now, on the Trump side, I mean, there are also difficulties. And let me just sort of mention a couple of them. You're deporting massive numbers of people without giving them individual hearings. These are people who are not wearing the uniform of an invading army, which is the traditional situation. And way back when we were doing all this stuff in the Middle East, there was always the question of what happens with people who are driving trucks for enemies in Al-Qaeda and so forth, but were not wearing the uniform. Were they military people who were subject to military procedures, or they're not? Generally speaking, the answer given was, if you don't know whether they're covered by the military stuff because they're not wearing a uniform, you have to give a hearing to find out whether or not they're within the jurisdiction of the case. You got 300-odd guys in these circumstances picked up. Some of them yes, some of them no. And I just don't know which are which. And I don't think the Trump administration really wanted to find that out.
Well, there's a couple of things. So one, I mean, you make a good point about recusal. There's other judges that can handle this. I don't know that that we wouldn't find similar track records with anything that is even tangentially related to Trump. But the other thing is, the Trump administration sent a letter to the appellate court asking for Boasberg to be removed from hearing the case over the Alien Enemies Act, which you're getting to. But they didn't make it over the course of conflict of interest or his decisions as a FISA judge, or in the Kleinsmith case, or in the J6 cases. They said the government cannot and will not be forced to answer sensitive questions of national security and foreign relations. They're basically saying, look, it's a predatory.
Nobody can do it then.
I think. I think you can't. I think what the argument is, you can't just cherry pick one of 700 federal district court judges to get to stop Article 2 powers that the executive possesses. And the other thing that Stephen Miller said is, first of all, they do know. I mean, this is what he argues. They do know these are Tren de Aragua gangbangers and related parties, in part because of the gang tattoos. But he said that they made representations in court as to their knowledge of this being a part of a predatory incursion, because these are all essentially organized criminals, members of TDA.
And I think, again, it's a real point there, but let me put it in a slightly different way. The argument that I'm making is much narrower than the argument that they made. At that point, they're saying it's an executive function, and no judge whatsoever can ask anything about these things. The answer that you haven't given is, look, we really did have kind of evidence of this stuff, tattoos and so forth. I think that's fair. The question of whether this counts as an invasion because it was authorized, quote unquote, by Maduro in Venezuela, another one of these really tough questions about the meaning of an invasion. Sneaking into a company without arms may or may not be an invasion. You want somebody else to decide that. And this is one of these terms when you get to hard cases, one way or the other. So you're going to need some kind of a judicial determination on that before you can get rid of them. The problem that Trump has is his own credibility. He basically moves first and justifies later in so many different fronts that I think many of these judges are battle weary. You saw just yesterday he fired 2 commissioners of the Democratic commissions of the FTC. He fired all the members of advisory boards, one kind or another. So what he's doing is giving an extraordinarily expansive interpretation of investment of executive power that doesn't only cover these cases, but essentially says it's a unitary executive, and judicial review in most cases is not going to be allowed. This is an enormous change from previous practice, and it's normally would be decided by a kind of a declaratory judgment. You first go into court, make the case, and then you act. But Trump is doing it the other way. He's first acting and then going into court, finding a defensive action.
Yeah, but he's the president. I just feel like activist judges have essentially taken control of the executive branch. I mean, what if stopping deportations, allowing transgenders in the military, they reversed that. USAID has to be restored now in certain aspects. I mean, is this normal behavior?
It turns out everything on both sides is sort of strange, and that's why it's so troublesome. I mean, look, on the military stuff with respect to the transgender issues, there are 2 things there which clearly resonate with the public, and I'm with them 100%. One of them is you don't have any minor surgeries or medical treatment, medicalization of these conditions for a 19-year-old. And then the other thing is you don't let men swim in women's events. The difficulty with the transgender stuff is if they have done it by consent, there's nobody whatsoever in the anti-movement who says they can't do that. And so why is their participation to be illegal if they haven't done anything that specifically violates any of the particular military norms? I don't see where the president has, under the current law, the executive authority to keep an entire class of people out of the military if they passed all the requisite requirements. So I'm very troubled about that. That's the thing about Trump. He drives me nuts in some sense, because half the time he's completely right. Half the time I think he's very dubious. And I think I can draw distinctions. He doesn't think that these are available. And on the other stuff with the terminations of these programs, many of these times the statutes are written in such a fashion that they may be terminated by a president, but it has to go through certain procedures. So I recently signed a letter, not to defend anybody at Columbia, but there were a large number of us professors who looked at Title VI and said, if you have an order which is designed to shut down a department and put it into receivership, there are requirements under the statute which you didn't meet, and you have to do it. And I'm saying this as somebody who's uneasy about this, even though the next sentence I was saying, if I were Columbia University, given the sorry state that you run this way, I would put these departments in receivership. I would basically review my entire way of teaching and hiring faculty members. And so the question about this is not whether he's right or wrong and what should be done. The hard question is he bound by any statute that Congress passes when you have to take care that the laws be faithfully executed? It means these restrictions as well. And so we are having here a definition of executive power on steroids. And yet in other cases, there's no doubt that he's surely right that these things are exclusive within his power. So if he wants to fire his Secretary of State, and of course says, no, you have to give the guy a hearing, that would be insanity.
So this is part of it. I mean, part of it is because, you know, these three co-equal branches of government have bled over into other branches, spaces intermittently, depending on the administration. And so the lines have gotten erased to some extent, and that's part of the problem. Some are being redrawn, others are not, so it's uneven, and that doesn't inspire much confidence either. But I take your point, like the 25,000 fire probationary workers were reinstated. That was a big headline, but they've only been reinstated for 2 weeks, and there are statutory strictures like 60-day notices within some of these agencies for some of these employees that need to be followed. So I get that. So that slows things down. But if you want to do it, you can still do it under the statute over time. But I guess what this in part should trigger is a little bit more focus on Speaker Johnson and Senate Majority Leader Thune to say, you want to start, exercising your power to revise some of these statutes so that the executive has more latitude, well, then go to it. But you have to do your job so that he can do his job with more facility and less interference from the courts.
Yeah, I agree with everything. Let's go back to the original design. We had a constitution with three branches, said in very harsh terms, sharp terms. I'm the Congress, I pass the laws, you're the president, you execute them, I'm the courts, we do them. Then what you do is you expand the power of Congress beyond any imagination. By the time you get to the New Deal revolution, everything bleeds over. You start having boards and administrative agencies, Article I courts, and so forth. And the old framework is clearly obsolete, and there's no way that you're going to be able to put it back. And so one of the really hard questions is, do we end independent agencies after having them around for about 90 years because they're not part of the original Constitution? And I've always taken the opposite position, that there's so many things that become so embedded in American life that it's like prescription. You get first you have a legal title, and then if it goes on long enough, it becomes legal title. I mean, if you want to go back to the beginning, let me just mention you some of the things you have to do. You have to get rid of judicial review.
Yeah.
Just not part of the original Constitution. You cannot get the federal government to examine decisions of state courts that essentially challenge constitutional provisions. That was also wrong originally. So many things were done, and what happens is we just have accepted them. And what Trump is doing is he's putting them all into play all at the same time. He may be right on some, wrong on the other, but what's happening to ordinary people is they're just kind of intellectual and moral fatigue and trying to sort their way through all of this stuff. I mean, look, if you look at DOJ and you ask whether or not the executive order allows him to appoint the man for that task without Senate confirmation, I think the answer is no. Just having read some of the cases about it, this is not a specific task. It's as general as anything, and they don't give any Senate confirmation. The famous case of Wiener back in 1958, where there was a much narrower war claims tribunal, there was executive authorization, narrow task with confirmation by the Senate of every member who sat on those tribunals. So, I mean, it's really very, very hard. And what happens is, if you're going out on one limb and doing everything else conventionally, people can start to live with that. But if you're moving in every direction simultaneously with an unprecedented speed and fury, there's going to be a fierce reaction. I think Elon Musk may be the most unpopular person in the United States today, even by some Republicans.
Yeah, but it seems to me this boils down to a pretty simple concept, and it with respect to this antagonism between federal district court, some federal district court judges and the administration. The concern that I have is a federal district court is essentially taking the position like Illinois courts have taken with respect to public sector pensions. We have something in place. It's a guarantee. and the only thing that you can do is increase it. You can't decrease it, which makes no sense.
You're right about that.
Right,
I mean,
which makes so. But my concern is that's exactly what some of these federal district court judges. We have a government that you inherited. The only thing you can do is hold it harmless or increase it, but you can't decrease it, and that's insanity.
That is insanity. And give you an illustration of that. Some of the environmental overreach with respect to West Virginia and these other cases on how it is you structure the enemy economy is a classic illustration of judicial overreach. And when the Supreme Court took after that in the West Virginia case about 2.5 years ago, all hell broke loose, but they were right about what it is that they did. So I'm making your point, you're making my point, is that what happens is you have a scale of 1 to 10. And what you do is you look at 100 different measures. There are going to be large concentrations at 0 or 1, and large concentrations at 10 and some in the middle. What's happened politically, however, is there is no center anymore. So you either get screaming Republicans or screaming Democrats. Think back what Adam Schiff did when he was censored a long time ago. Only Republicans censored him. But he was engaged in very serious activities of misleading federal courts about the threat which never existed because Trump was supposedly an ally of Putin. This stuff is really very, very toxic. And nobody seems to care about the consequences to the long-term stability of the system by these horrible short-term allegations. And when you mention the light sentence that, that Boasberg gave in the FBI case, that's just an outrage that you should do that. I mean, my God, every criminal has a family, right? And so therefore we can never put anybody in jail for more than 10 days because their children are going to be mourning for him. The hope is that you will realize that since you have a family, and if you are subject to punishment by the law, it's going to dislocate your family life. What you would do is you would not engage in the activity which would in fact cause you such harm to yourself and your family. So in an odd way, you say you can't deter a criminal because what's going to happen is if you deter the criminal, the family's going to be very upset about it. It's the end of the criminal law.
Well, it's right. It's the same thing that's been going on with the immigration arguments, too, with people in this country illegally, and it's just absurd.
Well, I mean, I have just we do agree on something. The birthright citizenship case is an exact illustration of this. There's not a shred of evidence, if you really go back and look closely at those documents, to support the notion that somehow or other the way in which you profit was to bring people illegally into the country. And yet the number of people who say it's perfectly evident that that's what the Constitution authorized by misreading the word subject to the jurisdiction thereof is very, very large. And so, I mean, you're very, very hard-pressed to figure out what you're supposed to do when the most fundamental distinction in the law is that between legal and illegal conduct. And then you have somebody telling you it really doesn't matter in this vital issue who comes into this country. And so think of it this way. Somebody comes into your house with your permission. Oh, that's okay, right? Now they enter the house without your permission. That's all right, too. Because we have the law. Which it doesn't matter whether the entry is legal. And if it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a country, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the house. The difference between legal and illegal is the very existence and survival of the legal system. And when people start telling me that it's irrelevant as a matter of first principle, I say to myself, how far do you extend this notion? And I can't think of extending it at all, so I just don't want to start down that path. And so, again, what's going on here is two things. One is who's right on the substance, and the other one is who's right on the procedures. And Trump is more often right on some of the end, but he's much too casual with some of the means. And it's on those grounds that I'm prepared to write against him. Remember my expression, Trump a la carte. You know what he does on one thing. You know he's doing another thing. You have no idea whether he's right on the first one or the second one, both or neither. That's his problem with me, because I just don't see him having what you need to be a great president is the discretion to figure out where you push hard and where it is you back off just a little bit.
Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor, Emeritus of Law, Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you as always.
It's always a great pleasure to be with you. Bye-bye, Dan. Bye-bye, Amy.
Bye. Have a great day. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. Coming up on Chicago's Morning Answer,
we'll talk to Heather McDonald about DEI and funding DEI on campus, 8:38.
But now let's head into the newsroom, and here is Joanne Jeanette.
Reporting today from the AM 560 newsroom, I'm Joanne Jeanette. St. Charles authorities say they have found no wrongdoing on behalf of police officers involved in a deadly